네, 이번에는 기조 강연을 듣도록 하겠습니다. 첫 번째 기조 강연자분을 소개를 해드려야 될 것 같은데요. 지지스 컨설팅 회장이신 텀 지지스님을 모시도록 하겠습니다. 변화하는 노동시장에 대한 대응이라는 주제로 기조 강연을 해주시도록 하겠습니다. 앞으로 모시겠습니다. 여러분 큰 박수로 맞이해 주십시오.
Good morning. It's a tremendous honor for me to be part of this process, particularly listening to the history, listening to all the effort that's gone into putting this symposium together and the foundations on which it rests. I want to thank the ICC DPP, the Korean Ministry of Education, and KRIVET for putting this conference together and for inviting me to this event. I know I'm going to learn a tremendous amount just looking at the agenda. I know based on last night's dinner, I'm also going to put on some weight during this symposium. I'm here to talk to you about the labor market context. Now, as you all know, the labor market has two sides to it. It has a supply side and a demand side. The supply side are those individuals who provide labor to workplaces, employees, individuals looking for work, individuals planning their careers, looking at their futures. The demand side are those who receive the labor, who accept the labor, who pay for the labor, provide wages, contracts, the employers. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that when we look at government policies around the world, by and large, the vast majority of effort and resources and budgets are focused on the supply side. Right? We have vast systems of education in terms of various levels of progression. We have vocational training and apprenticeship programs. We have employment services that help assist individuals to access employment. We have career guidance professionals and others who are helping people to find their way in the labor market. And far less attention really is paid to the demand side. We look to the supply side to adjust to what the demand side is doing, whereas we spend less effort trying to see how we can also influence what the demand side is doing. Now, I know in this symposium we have these workbooks where we're going to be talking about what are the key messages from each speaker. So I'm going to let you know what my key message is. We need to focus more on the demand side. We need to develop strategies that also influence what employers are doing in order to ensure that we improve the labor market outcomes of individuals. Now, I'm not saying that the efforts and resources that are placed on the supply side are somehow misguided. Not at all. They're absolutely necessary. But in terms of the overall picture, in terms of the balance of resources and effort, I think we've neglected trying to influence the demand side. Now, I may not speak in terms of what's happening in each country, but I certainly can speak in terms of what I've seen from my home country, Canada, and typically the North American experience. And I came to this perspective looking at the great emphasis that was being placed on post-secondary, on tertiary education in Canada. We were being told that we're moving into a knowledge economy, and it was extremely important for us to develop the educational skills in order to compete. And as a labor market analyst, when I started looking at the data, it was a surprise to me to see that Canada actually had the highest rate of tertiary educational attainment in the world. And when I would be making that kind of pronouncement to audiences in Canada, they were actually shocked because typically when these kinds of messages about promoting education are made, we're always made in comparison to other countries, and we always feel we must be falling behind. We're not doing enough in terms of education. Well, in Canada, that wasn't the case. And here are the statistics from OECD for 25 to 64-year-olds in terms of tertiary educational attainment. Canada is roughly around 55%, but many countries have high levels of achievement, 40% and over. These represent many of the countries that are present here today. The OECD, the average is 35%. When we look at the young adults, 25 to 34-year-olds, their educational achievement is even higher. And in fact, over the last 10 years, they have increased their educational achievements substantially. In the OECD countries, on average, roughly 10%. From 2005, they had a rate of 32% achievement of tertiary education, and by 2015, it was 42%. So in many ways, our populations have been responding to this call, as you all well know. But I want to look at some of the outcomes that they experience. And I have two slides that I want to present. These represent the proportion of tertiary education degree holders who make twice the median income. So that's some measure of success, let's say. Make twice as much as what the median income is. This is data from 34 countries, mainly OECD members and some OECD partner countries. So I didn't want to start naming countries, but just to show on the horizontal axis, that represents the level of the proportion of the population that has tertiary education. And the vertical axis is the percentage of them who make more than twice the median income. And you can see the trend line is that the higher the proportion of your population that has a tertiary education, the smaller proportion of them who make twice the median income. Now, statistically, that may not be such a surprise because if everyone is starting to get an education, then you're not going to see those who have an education be performing that much better than their peers because so many others have a degree. So maybe that's not such a surprise. For me, what is a surprise is the next slide, the proportion who make half the median income. So the same vertical and horizontal axis. So on the horizontal axis, the percentage who have tertiary education. And on the vertical axis, the percentage of them who make less than half the median income. Okay? And you can see the trend line. The more your population has a high percentage of individuals with a tertiary degree, the more of them make less than half the median income. And that dot right at the top right-hand corner, that's Canada. Right? We lead the world in post-secondary educational attainment, but also in the proportion of our citizens who make less than half the median income who hold a tertiary degree. So for me, that brought up the question, well, if the supply side is in part at least responding to the requirements around education, what else might be happening? And that's what brought me to start looking at the demand side. So let me address some of the items that we reference when we talk about the changing labor market. The first one I'm going to talk about is inequality. It's a topic that's been very prominent in political discussions over the last 10 or 15 years. There are many slides I could have chosen. I've chosen this slide because actually the colors worked out best. But this is very representative of many other data that you would see. This shows on the bottom horizontal line a number of EU countries, and finally the EU average and the US average. And the yellow line is the third of occupations that earn the highest. The red are the third that earn in the middle category, and the blue are the third that earn in the lowest category. And over the course of 13 or 15 years, almost every country has seen a decline in that middle category. Okay, this is called the polarization of occupations. Roughly 5 to 15% on average, a decline in the proportion of occupations in the middle category, not all going to the high-end category, but often split. It doesn't apply to every country, but certainly applies to many of the advanced industrialized countries. This, sometimes called an hourglass labor market, increases at the two ends of the labor market. What often happens also in a number of these countries, in many of the countries, is that as the wage rates for low, middle, and high are changing at different rates. That by and large, for the low wage occupations, the wages have been, in real terms, relatively flat. For medium, somewhat slight increase, but highest increase for the higher occupations. The end result being a far greater increase in terms of the inequality. So the degree to which the labor market is contributing to what we see in terms of income inequality largely has to do with the shifts in terms of occupations. The other item I want to mention is technology. Now we've heard so much about technology, and I would say 15 years ago, if we had asked economists what their predictions were, the common view was that, yes, technology does displace jobs, but its contribution to improved productivity and increased GDP means that it stimulates demand for other goods and other services at the higher end, that over the long term it actually contributes to an expansion of the economy and an expansion of employment. The real challenge is the transition, that as we make transitions caused by technology, that there are those who are not able to adjust, that there are industries that are made, occupations that are made obsolete, and those individuals often have a harder time making the transition into the new occupations. That has been the major challenge around technology. More recently, I think the jury now is becoming uncertain about what the future holds. A number of publications that I've listed here say that perhaps this time it might be different for several reasons. Certainly the speed at which technological change is occurring. Secondly, the reference to not just routine tasks being displaced by technology. And I'm just going to return to that previous slide. Many of those middle category jobs, there was a study done by Professor Autor in Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who distinguished occupations according to whether they were routine or non-routine functions and whether they are cognitive or manual. And he found that by and large, the great loss of jobs was among the routine jobs, both manual and cognitive. So whether you were a bookkeeper, whether your function could be replaced by a software, could be automated, could be set into a series of rules that could be easily followed by individuals with less skills so that the jobs could be outsourced to lower paying jurisdictions. That was the reason for many of the job losses. But that the non-cognitive, the cognitive non-routine and the manual non-routine jobs were the categories that increased. But with the changes in AI and artificial intelligence, the concern now is that, in fact, those non-routine jobs will be subject to more replacement through technology. That it's not necessarily just jobs that will be replaced, but the cumulative effect of various functions within various occupations will have an impact in terms of the net number of jobs that are required. Machines that can learn by applying algorithms, by examining a range of data, so that in fact individuals, humans, will be required less to program them. And those machines will share that information through the Internet of Things in order to teach other machines gives us cause for concern. On the other hand, yes, this is part of the new industrial revolution, the 4.0 that is talked about, but what it refers to is particularly in areas like advanced manufacturing and in logistics, the ability for machines to actually displace a lot of the cognitive functions that humans performed. And finally, I just mentioned quickly that employment among technology-based firms often represents a lower number of jobs that were typically you'd expect in terms of the value of that company. I mean, for example, when Facebook bought Instagram, Facebook paid $1 billion for Instagram. Instagram had 13 employees. Minecraft is bought by Microsoft. Microsoft pays $2.5 billion for Minecraft. Minecraft has 41 employees. So the ratio between the value of what is being produced in a digital economy and how many workers are necessary to produce it is completely disproportionate to what we experienced in the manufacturing era. Next up, I just want to talk about, I guess, the changes in terms of our employment relationships, having moved from typically permanent full-time employment to a more distanced relationship. Companies relying on contracted individuals or contracting firms to deliver the employment. Typically in those situations, there's a reduction in the investment in training, the investment in career advancement, and also a rise in the violations according to various employment standards. I would refer you to this book, The Fissured Workplace, which gives a wonderful illustration of this in the American context. I put up a picture of this smiling individual, not because I wanted to cheer you up, but because this is a FedEx driver, but he's not an employee. He's contracted to perform this function, even though he wears a FedEx uniform or drives a FedEx truck. So we're not always even aware when these changes are taking place. Financialization of the economy, the emphasis that is being placed on short-term shareholder value and reduction in investment in items that have a longer-term horizon, whether it's R&D or training in workers, is being driven to a large extent by a different view of how corporations govern themselves. Whereas in the past, CEOs would typically make these decisions based on their own business acumen. Now they're being driven by an investment community that is also giving them the incentive by tying their compensation to share value, and also having a stick that warns them that if they don't perform in terms of meeting the quarterly expectations, that their company might be subject to a hostile takeover. So I know I'm bringing you a lot of good news here. So let me raise a few issues about how to respond. I think the first thing I want to say is that we need to look at our responses to the labor market in a broader perspective. That is not only how we improve educational attainment or what kind of employment services or what kind of career counseling we provide. We also need to look at what employers are doing and how they're organizing work, the degree to which they're investing in the workplace. We need to look at the labor legislation respecting the gig economy or zero contract work and other alternate forms of employment to ensure that equity is continued in the labor market, but also look at items like taxation policy and how companies are governed. These are also matters that influence how the labor market ultimately performs. If we have legislation that guides companies to think more in terms of the whole range of stakeholders and not only shareholders that look at the long-term health of a company, that also has an influence on the kind of labor market performance that's delivered by that company. In terms of career guidance professionals, again, I want to emphasize that what is being done is very necessary. And it's sufficient only to the extent that it helps that individual in comparison to another individual who doesn't get that support. But if we want to have better labor market outcomes, we also have to improve the number of good jobs that exist and the access to those good jobs on the part of individuals. So let me, just in terms of the symposium discussions, let me just provide a little bit of a framework in the 1 minute that I have left to help you in your deliberations. The first thing I'll say is that we have far less data about employers than we have about job seekers or individuals looking for work. We really do not collect the qualitative data about employers. We know what industry they're in, we know the size of employment, but we don't always examine what their business values are, what is driving their corporate decisions. So I'm just putting out there in terms of the data. We need to look at individual employer practices, why they train, why they may not train, what are the barriers, is it matters of cost, is it knowing which training, what is the best certificate, concerns about employees being poached by others. The broader environment that supports employers, so intermediary organizations that can link them to training bodies, that can link them to educational institutions, that can facilitate the connections between supply and demand. In the North American experience, we're familiar with workforce development boards or workforce planning boards as an example. Unions obviously play that role as well. But then there's the larger norms and values that we as a community or as a society establish in terms of what our expectations of our economy, in terms of how it delivers good jobs and decent wages to individuals. And I think career professionals have an opportunity to have a role to play at all three of those levels, in terms of the conversation with employers, in terms of as a professional body acting as an intermediary between supply and demand, and also in terms of how they influence the broader expectations we have of the labor market. Okay? I wish you well in your discussions, and I look forward to the symposium conversations. Thank you.